Hi, I'm Shauntay, if you guys didn't know me. Um, July 4th didn't free me, Juneteenth did. Frederick Douglass famously asked, "What to a slave is the 4th of July?" I could stand here and talk about the cognitive dissonance of how the founding fathers demanded freedom from a monarchy while simultaneously taking advantage of slavery and forced labor. How they stated all men were created equally, but their empire required forced labor from people they inherently thought were worth less than they were. But we know all of that. What is a little less known is the history of Juneteenth and its significance to not only Black history, but US history as a whole. One of my favorite hobbies is history. I love learning and analyzing historical facts and the historical impacts still rippling through society today. Without a doubt, when you tell people that you love history, they ask, what is your favorite era or what is your favorite subject to learn about? Mine is the antebellum South through the Civil War and into the first Reconstruction era because I find it fascinating. But before I get into the history and the significance of Juneteenth, here are some general facts about slavery that are often misconstrued. When we think about slavery, we often think of plantations with hundreds and hundreds of slaves, veranda-wrapped big houses, overseers on horsebacks. However, outside of Dixie, which is the deep South, including Texas, parts of Oklahoma, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, owning lots and lots of slaves, that picture we have in our head, wasn't true. Most slaveholders outside of Dixie in mid-Missouri, nicknamed Little Dixie, a family on a farm or a plot of land would have 1 or 2 slaves, up to a small family of slaves. The second misconception is that slaves were treated awful. While slaves were mistreated and were doing forced labor, they cost a lot of money and therefore were looked at more of it as an investment or a tool. And so slave owners treated their slaves well, quotation marks, well, because they were protecting an investment. And the last thing to throw in is that slaves and slave owners were participating in a reciprocal relationship, meaning that each other were getting things from each other. So I love the antebellum period because in slave-owning states, slaves outnumbered white people on average of 8-1, but in some areas up to 32-1. So why did they not rise up? And why were the ones that did so unsuccessful? The short answer goes back to them having a reciprocal relationship, and essentially slaves having a case of Stockholm Syndrome. Equally as fascinating to me was why slaves did not run away as more often than they did, and again, it goes back to having a reciprocal relationship. So when I was younger, I absolutely could not wrap my head around the fact that slaves fought for the Confederacy. There were Black slaves that fought against their own freedom. Not to say that slaves fighting for the Union fared any better, because oftentimes they were sent in for slaughter, and then the white infantry would come in behind them to finish the battle. So the Civil War ends on April 9th, 1865, almost 4 years to the day after it started. Slaves are freed by the second edition of the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on September 22nd, 1862. It went into effect on January 1st, 1863, and the slaves are freed. All seems better, right? Wrong. The slaves in Dixie, the deepest part of the South, more specifically in Texas, where there were not a lot of Union bases, the slaves didn't know they'd been freed. The slave owners just didn't tell them. So the Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 18th, 1865. The next day, on June 19th, General Gordon Granger of the United States Army announced that the slaves in Texas were freed by order of the President of the United States. These enslaved people were denied their freedom for 18 months, so obviously that day is a day for celebration. Juneteenth gets its name from combining the words June 19th. Juneteenth started as a holiday celebrated mostly in Texas and now has grown to a national federally recognized holiday. Juneteenth is always on a Sunday, while celebrations will range the entire weekend, and Monday is the paid holiday. While some people might call this a win, most people realize that this is merely progress. Progress because minority groups, especially African Americans, are being targeted, whether directly or indirectly, by legislation seeking to take away hard-fought freedoms and acts of violence. Now, sometimes progress looks really weird. Walmart this summer started selling Juneteenth ice cream that's red velvet flavored, and no one really knows why they're selling Juneteenth ice cream or it's red velvet flavored. So they're monetizing on a holiday that they really shouldn't be, but also it's raising a lot of awareness to people that previously didn't know about Juneteenth. Nevertheless, Juneteenth is being recognized as the latest in a list of progress that has been made since the Reconstruction era. It was not until 3 months ago that lynching was considered a federal hate crime. 4 months ago, you may or may not have been federally charged with a hate crime for hanging somebody because they were Black. Up until 2020, when the Crown Act was passed, and still in a lot of places today, Black people can be fired because of their natural hair. I can keep going on and on about how we are criminalized because we are Black and how we still have a long way to go, but in the same breath, I am grateful for the progress that is being made. Like Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Progress. The most important thing is that we keep progressing, both individually and as a whole. Progress for me means that I keep learning. Just this week on TikTok, weird source, I learned an interesting Black history fact. The FBI is looking into Emmett Till's case and kind of dancing around questions if they're reopening it, but they are reinvestigating it. And more details are coming out. The men that ended up kidnapping and murdering Emmett Till first took another Black boy, beat him up, and when Carolyn Bryant, the woman that falsely accused Emmett Till of whistling at her, said it was the wrong boy, they threw him out of a moving car before going and taking Emmett from his uncle's house and ultimately murdering him that night. There is a possibility that the FBI is looking into charges for Carolyn Bryant. That is progress. Progress is millions of people learning about the Tulsa Massacre because of the first episode of The Watchmen, a primetime show on HBO. Progress is charges being brought against the police who shoot unarmed Black people. Progress is the fact that it appears politicians are finally working across the aisle on gun control, almost 9 years to the day after the Charleston Massacre, and on the heels of horrific shootings across the country, some racially motivated. Progress is national agencies issuing threat levels and warnings against white nationalists, naming them the most direct and dangerous threat to the United States of America. Progress is the police and the FBI taking a tip of 31 white males in the back of a U-Haul in Idaho, seriously, and arresting them and charging them. Progress is the best that we can ask for and the most that we can hope for, because small events over time can change our society for the better. One of my favorite TV shows once said, "Transitions in life are usually marked by major events, birthdays, graduations, weddings, but the greater transitions often come out of smaller moments when we stop and look at who we are. Because each time we see how far we've come, we also see how far we still have to go. In order to fully transform, we might need to free ourselves of everything we've been holding on to send us on our new path, the right one. Our right path is progress."